Today we're going to look at factoring by brute force. So there are 7 steps that we're going to use when we talk about brute force. The first step is to make sure that the equation is in standard form. In standard form, just as a reminder, is ax squared plus bx plus c. Second step says to factor out the greatest common factor, which we call GCF quite a bit. The third step is to multiply the a and the c. So that's going to be the number that's in front of your x squared and your constant. So just for an example, let's say we had the equation 2x squared plus 7x plus 5. If that was what we were trying to factor, we would start by multiplying the 2 times the 5. Then it says list the factor pairs of the product. Well, if we were talking about that example I just used, 2 times 5, the product would be 10. So then the factor pairs would be 1 times 10 and 2 times 5. Step 5 says select the factor pairs that add up to b, which is the middle term. So in this example, that means they add up to 7. So 2 times 5 is 10, and 2 plus 5 is 7. Then you would replace b, which is the middle term again, with the factor pair, which means you're going to fill in this 2 and this 5. So if we were doing this example, we would bring down the 2x squared, but instead of putting 7, we're going to put plus 2x plus 5x. Then we would bring down this plus 5. Then it says factor by grouping, which is what we're going to do on the next several slides. So this chart is an overview of what we talked about yesterday with the what two numbers activity. So if our a times c is a positive number and the middle term is a positive number, that means both our factors are going to be positive. If our a times c was positive, but the middle term is negative, that means both our factors are negative. If when we multiply that first and that last, that a times c though, and we get a negative number, the middle number's positive, that means we have to have 2 different signs. So if we're using 2 different signs, that means the bigger number is going to be positive, but the smaller number is negative, if that middle term is a positive number. Now, if we multiply together and we still get that negative, but this time the middle term is negative, you still have 2 different signs, but the bigger number is negative this time, and the smaller number is going to be positive if that middle term is negative. Okay, so let's start with example 1. So the first thing is to make sure it's in standard form, which it is, the x squared, then the x, then the constant. We want to see if there's a greatest common factor for our numbers that are out front, our coefficients, which are 2, 9, and 10. There's not a greatest common factor other than 1. So that means we're going to multiply. We're going to multiply the a squared term by the constant. So 2 times 10 is 20. And we're going to come over to the side and write 20. And we're going to list all our factor pairs rather for 20. So we would have 1 times 20. We would have 2 times 10. And we would have 4 times 5. Now we want the pair that's going to add together to give us this middle term of 9 and multiply together to give us this 20, which is going to be 4 and 5. So now we're going to go to step number 6 and replace that middle term with the factor pair. So we're going to bring down this first term, which is 2x squared, but in the middle, instead of putting this 9, we're putting our factor pair. So plus 4x plus 5x, and then we still bring down this last term, which is plus 10. So we haven't changed anything because 4 plus 5 is still 9. But now we're going to group them. So we're going to put parentheses around the first 2 terms, parentheses around the last 2 terms. Okay, now we're going to look at these first 2 terms. and we're going to say, what's the greatest common factor of 2x squared and 4x? So you're going to start with your numbers. The biggest number that goes into both 2 and 4 is 2. Then you're going to say they both have x's. So I'm going to take the smallest x out, which is plain x. But now I still have to have something inside this parentheses. I had 2 terms, so I'm going to have 2 blanks. Now I'm going to divide. I'm going to divide the coefficients. 2 divided by 2 gives me 1. And I'm going to subtract my x's. 2x's minus 1x is an x. And I'm going to do the same thing with the second term. I'm going to divide my coefficients. So 4 divided by 2 is positive 2. I'm going to subtract my x's. X minus x is nothing. Then I'm going to go to the second set of parentheses and do the same thing. But now this is a plus here, so I'm going to bring down a plus. Then I'm going to say, what's my greatest common factor for 5x and 10? So the biggest number that goes into 5 and 10 is 5. Then I'm going to take out the x's. This one has an x, but notice the 10 doesn't have an x, so there's none in common. So parentheses, I had 2 terms, so I'm going to put 2 blanks. I'm going to divide. 5 divided by 5 is 1. I'm going to subtract my x's. 1x, there's no x's here, so 1 minus 0 is still 1. Then I'm going to go to the second one and divide it. 10 divided by 5 is positive 2. Now, notice how what's inside the parentheses is the same. That's what should happen every single time. So to write your final answer, you're going to write what's inside the parentheses one time, which is 1x plus 2. Then you're going to put a second set of parentheses right beside it, and whatever's in front goes in that. So 2x, and in front of this one, we have a plus 5. This is your final answer. So example 2, we have x squared plus 8x plus 12. Now I'm going to make this x squared a 1x squared. Okay, so now we're going to multiply. So we don't have a greatest common factor since we have a 1 in front. There's not anything that can go into 1, 8, and 12. So we'll multiply our a times c. So 1 times 12 is 12. So to multiply together to get 12, we can use 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 and 4. Now we need the pair that will also add together to give us 8, which is going to be 2 and 6. So 2 plus 6 is 8, and 2 times 6 is 12. So we're going to fill in. So we'll bring down this first one, which is 1x squared. And instead of putting 8x, we're going to put plus 2x plus 6x and plus 12. So now we'll group. We'll put parentheses around the first two, parentheses around the last two. Then we're going to look at the first two and find our greatest common factor. So we'll start with the coefficients. The biggest number that goes into 1 and 2 is just 1. And then we'll look at our x's. X squared and x, the smallest x is just x. Then we'll put a parenthesis, 2 terms, 2 blanks. Divide your coefficients. 1 divided by 1 is 1. Subtract your x's. 2x minus 1x is x. Same thing to the second term. Divide the coefficients. 2 divided by 1 is positive 2. Subtract your x's. X minus x is 0. Then this is a plus outside the second set of parentheses, so we'll bring that down. Then we'll look at the greatest common factor on the last two. So the biggest number that goes into 6 and 12 is 6. The 6 has an x, but notice the 12 doesn't, so we don't take an x out. Then we're going to put our parenthesis, 2 terms, 2 blanks. Divide your coefficients. 6 divided by 6 is 1. Subtract your x's. 1x, there's not even an x here to subtract, so 1 minus nothing is still 1. Divide 12 divided by 6 is positive 2. Notice how you have the same thing in each set of parentheses. That's what should happen every single time. If they're not the same, you're doing something incorrectly. So to write your final answer, you'll bring down what's in the parentheses one time, which is 1x plus 2. And then in your set of parentheses right beside it, you'll put what's in front of them. So 1x plus 6. And this is your final answer. So example 3, we have 3x squared minus 16x plus 5. So no greatest common factor here, nothing that goes into 3, 16, and 5 other than 1. So we're going to multiply a times b. So 3 times 5 is 15. So to multiply together to get 15, we'd have 1 and 15, and we could use 3 and 5. Now notice this time, though, our middle term is a negative number. So our factor, or our product rather, our product is positive, but our middle one's negative, which means both of our terms need to be negative. So now which one of these pairs will add together to give us negative 16 now, which is negative 1 plus negative 15. And then our product is still a positive 15. So we're going to fill in. So we'll bring down this first term, which is 3x squared. Then we'll fill in our factor pair. So minus 1x minus 15x. Bring down this last one, which is plus 5. And now I'm going to group the first two, 3x squared and 1x, negative 15x and 5. Then I'm going to do greatest common factor to the first two. So biggest number that goes into 3 and 1 is just 1. Then we have an x squared and an x. The smallest x is just an x. Parenthesis, two terms, two blanks. Divide. 3 divided by 1 is 3. Subtract your x's. 2x minus 1x is just 1x. Notice this time when we divide, we'll have negative 1 divided by 1, which is negative 1. Okay, notice in this second set, I have a negative here, so I'm going to bring that down. Then I'm going to say, what's my greatest common factor here for 15 and 5? Ignore the negative for a second. So the biggest number that goes into 15 and 5 is 5. We have an x with the 15, but no x with the 5. So parenthesis. Then we're going to divide. So if I divide negative 15 divided by negative 5, I get positive 3. Bring down that x. If I look at the second term, I have positive 5 divided by negative 5, which is negative 1. Close parenthesis. Remember that these set of parentheses, you should have the exact same thing, which we do. So that's the first part of our answer, 3x minus 1. The second part is what's out in front of them. So 1x minus 5. And this is our final answer. Now I know there's still an example 4, 5, and 6 on your note sheet. So I'm going to stop the video here and I want you to try example 4 on your own, and then we'll go over example 4, 5, and 6 together in class.